It's my great pleasure today to introduce Darroch Bratt. Darroch is a final year PhD student, PhD candidate with us here in Orkney in the UHI Archaeology Institute. And Darroch has worked for about 10 years in the whisky industry himself, as well as studied anthropology in Aberdeen before moving into archaeology with the University of Highlands and Islands. So he's combining several long interests here in this talk today. As I said, he's in his final year of his PhD, and the topic that he's working on is the origins and history of distilling and whisky production in the Scottish Highlands and Islands. So that's what we'll hear about today. So without more ado, it's over to you, Darroch.
Thank you very much. I can't believe there are so many people here. It's great. So yeah, thank you, Raggy, for the invite, and yeah, thank you to everyone who's come. It's so flattering that people want to hear. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to present the main thrust of my research for the last few years into the archaeology and history of distilling in the Highlands. I'm going to do this in a way that's basically chronological, because I had an inkling that a lot of people would attend, so I didn't want to be too in depth and detailed. I thought it'd be good to do a sort of broad brush chronology that also incorporates a lot of the major findings and themes that have arisen in my research. And this research really sits against a few large moves in the archaeology of the Highlands and Islands and the history of the region as well. The first of these would really be a archaeological one, which has sought to really understand much better the medieval or later landscape and rural settlement. And this has really come along leaps and bounds in the last few decades. But there are still big gaps, and especially when that relates to industry. So things like bloomeries, they're becoming better understood, but they're perhaps a slightly late addition to the historical environment record. And the second backdrop is that we were in the last few years developing a much better idea of commercial practice in this region as something that was a little bit distinct from, but very much related to the country too. And I suppose the final backdrop that this sits against is a much more anachronistic perception of the Highlander as essentially very conservative, often very sort of prejudiced accounts will describe Highlanders as indolent and lazy, and will describe people's poverty in those terms. So what I hope to do in this talk is to demonstrate that distilling sits in all of these traditions, but will challenge that perception of the Highlander too. And I really want to show you all what a dynamic and changing set of skills distillation is, and that it's been highly reactive to external forces on the Highlands and to improvements of improvement in the Highlands as well. There's a sort of a sub theme as well that I quite like to embrace the idea of kind of diversity in the historical and archaeological record, and I'll go into that a little bit too. So I quite like all these themes to be in everyone's head as I talk today, although I understand quite a lot of them. So I'll just go here. Before I talk about the history and archaeology of this practice, it's probably good to make sure that everyone really knows what it entails. So in principle, it's quite simple. To make whiskey or aquavita or ushkava, you basically create a beer by mixing water and malted grain, usually barley. And then you use yeast to ferment it. And then you you boil that off in a still, which you can see on the right-hand side of your screen. And I'd like to thank Matt Ritchie for sending me this really nice illustration, actually. When that beer boils, and the beer is called wash, it passes along this line arm into a worm, which is a coiled piece of copper pipe. And that is cooled, usually by water, and it's then collected at the end of that worm. And what you collect is a spirit. Usually that will be distilled twice. The first distillation produces something quite weak, around 25%, and then the second much more strong. And we even have instances in the historical record of people distilling things 3 times or even 4 times, which was quite a dangerous spirit, very, very strong. So although the method is always basically the same, there are certainly different types of distillation that we can talk about in a social context. And for my own thinking, I break these down into 4 sort of types of distillation. The first would be private or domestic distilling, which is the extension of the household economy. And you use that for your own consumption, but you also sell it locally and perhaps further afield as well. And it's practiced quite widely throughout the Highlands. I expect we're gathering more information on that as we go just now. The second type of distilling I consider is illicit distillation. And that's any distillation that avoids duties to the excise, avoids paying taxes, essentially. So that can really be quite a diverse set of things. We could be talking about big commercial distilleries, cooking their books, really, but usually what we talk about is small-scale producers producing whiskey and smuggling it to avoid paying any duties to the government. The third type is farmhouse distillation, and this is especially important after the Excise Act in 1824, and that's distilling as a kind of satellite activity to a farm and a complement to a farm. And then the fourth and final that I talk about is a large commercial distilling concern. We can really understand all of these to be commercial, so I guess what I really mean is a capitalist distilling concern. But please bear in mind that this is a very teleological thing that I've presented you, and in reality, it's very messy, and all these things overlap by time and place. You can, for example, have illicit distilling happening close to any of these other legal ways to distill. While looking at the historical record, we have several types of distillation, of evidence for distillation. I won't go through all of these, but we have Justice of the Peace and Sheriff Court records are very important for looking at illicit distillation. Memoirs and travellers' accounts, especially in the late 18th and early 19th century, give us loads and loads of information that essentially observes distilling. Parliamentary papers, as people try and understand and regulate this practice as well. And then we have, multiple other types of documentary evidence, including the old and new statistical accounts, which are incredible sources of information that essentially bookend that period of illicit distilling I was talking about, which generally we take to mean running from the 1780s to the 1820s, although it went on long after that. So I'll go through these types of distillation. And I mean, this is a slide that isn't very pretty, but I'm rather proud of. So one of the largest things I've really come across as an original piece of research here is that in Inverness, there was actually a very early genesis of commercial distilling in private domestic spaces. In fact, in Inverness in the 1560s, there are records for 40 people acting as distillers. operating their small private distilleries. That's probably often in the home. And 40 out of those 40 people, 37 of them were definitely women. The other 3 perhaps were licensed under the name of men. This is definitely a commercial activity that they go into in the borough court records, how this was regulated, how prices were fixed, where you could sell it to, and who was allowed to be engaged in this. And in fact, there were, and I think it was 1563, deemed to be far too many people distilling, and only 4 licenses were given out. 3 of those went to the men, and only 1 to a woman distiller. We also get an idea of how important distilling was seen commercially as a commercial practice quite early in the statutes of Iona, where the importation of strong wines and spirits to the islands is made illegal, and the islanders were encouraged to distill for themselves. Late in that century, Martin recorded 3 types of spirit being made by islanders, all basically under the umbrella of Ushkaba, which I'm probably pronouncing horribly, so I apologize. But this is happening alongside other broad trends in the economic history of the Highlands, including some big commercialization efforts. We see in this period the development of droving, which is the raising of cattle in the Highlands and driving them to markets outside the Highlands. And from the 1750s, we also see a sort of a rise of kelping, which has some interesting similarities with distilling. But the first big distilling concern we can really talk about is Farintosh, which is located on the Black Isle. There have been many iterations of Farintosh over the years, but what I'm going to talk about now is the concern that's established in 1690. In 1689, there was a Jacobite uprising, and Forbes of Culloden, who owned the land of Farintosh, had already been using it as a brewery of aquavita, is how it's referred to in the records. And this was razed to the ground by the Jacobites. But for Forbes of Culloden's role in putting down the Jacobite rebellion, the government allowed him to produce whiskey on his land without paying the normal taxes that would be due on it, and that would have been due since the 60s. So he let that right to distill at a joint rate to his tenants and encouraged them to come onto his land and distill. That led to a huge growth in population, and Webster's census in 1755 shows that 2,590 people lived in this very small area on the Black Isle, and also all of them were Protestants, which is significant. A similar instance is also shown on Islay, where Daniel Campbell of Shawfield, who was an MP for Glasgow, supported the malt tax in 1725, which was very unpopular. It sought to essentially bring Scottish malt taxes into line with English ones, and it was seen by many Scots as a betrayal of the Union. They thought Scots should pay a lower tax because they had a lower quality of barley. But Campbell supported the bill, and his home was razed to the ground. But for his role in supporting the bill, and also in compensation for his losses, the government gave him a huge amount of money, which he used to buy the island of Islay. And excise duties were farmed to Campbell of Shawfield. And what that means essentially is that he paid a very small amount of money to government, and they didn't try and raise excise from whiskey made on his land. So there's a really interesting dynamic with Protestantism and whiskey distillation. So in the period of illicit distilling, Tom Devine, the historian, draws a direct correlation between Jacobite sentiment and Catholicism and distillation, but actually these really big early concerns they're very much connected with loyalty to the monarchy and with a sort of alignment with the idea of Protestantism. In the 1780s, things began to change very dramatically. The Wash Act of 1784 really changed things, and I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about the Wash Act, but it is a very interesting topic, and if you're interested in it, there's a great YouTube channel called The Liquid Antiquarian, and they do an episode about this, which I would recommend to people, because it's really made quite accessible. But I'll go over the implications for the Highland region of this act. The first was in limiting the number of stills that were allowed to operate in each parish, and they had a minimum size. So until 1779, all Highlanders were allowed to distill in their own homes in stills of no more than 10 gallons in size. And suddenly we were only allowed 2 in each parish, and they had to be very, very big. And you could only use grain grown in that parish. And another stipulation was that this Highland line, which I've shown very roughly in blue here, that's only an approximate route of it. That Highland line was introduced, and you weren't allowed to export whiskey from the Highlands to anywhere beyond that line. What this unintentionally did was it really created the perfect conditions for a smuggling industry to flourish. I'm not someone who advocates for light touch taxation and regulation generally, but it seems that this was far too much, far too quickly, and it created this smuggling industry. And indeed, the Wash Act of 1784 actually changed quite a lot, and there were various amendments and acts that came after it, but generally they made the situation worse. Again, this is happening alongside larger international events. The Napoleonic Wars at the end of the century caused an enormous shortage of brandy, and so there was an appetite for spirits that wasn't really being met. The urbanization that was happening at that time also led to a lot of people demanding more drink, possibly because conditions were harsh in the cities, but also we shouldn't write out the idea that life was quite convivial. A lot of people in new places. Imagine the whole country going to university at the same time. That sort of thing. So these were happening for a long time, and it really persisted until the 1820s, which I will get to. But we're going to talk now about the archaeology associated with the illicit distilling of spirits. On the left here, you can see a sort of a rough typology that was worked up by Michael Given from the University of Glasgow. And it's based on quite a small and random collection of sites. So it's not supposed to be representative of everything, but it shows you that we've got large bothies for distilling to occur in, small sort of just hearths, and even smaller, more ephemeral platforms where distilling could happen in the open. I'm going to add to that typology in a moment, but I think first it's worth saying that we know of loads of these sites in the historic environment record, but really they're only a fraction of what's really out there. Often the distribution we see in the HER is showing where people who know or have an interest in these types of sites have looked for them. So we don't really have a great idea of the distribution of them in the Highlands. And the other thing to point out is that there were enormous numbers of people involved in this at every level of society. Just the Elgin district, really, we can take prosecutions for Elgin in 1822, 4,774 people prosecuted for illicit distillation, 5,000 the year after that. So really huge numbers of people, and landowners were hesitant to enforce legislation because they needed to sell their barley and they needed to raise their rents. So illicit distillation really worked for everyone in society. So here's illicit distilling Bothy. It's my personal favourite. It's in Strathconnan, which is north of Inverness. I can show you Strathconnan there in the red. So I wanted to use this picture because it shows quite a typical location for one of these places. Often descriptions can be a little bit romantic, talking about gullies and so on. But this is a really good example of one of these sites, quite exposed really, but it's in a hanging valley and it's very well hidden from below. It's actually almost impossible to see until you're within meters of it. And it's really quite large, this one. It's one of the larger that I've come across. And as you can see, it's a fairly ephemeral type of archaeology. We're talking about dry stone walls and some features which in the case of this site aren't very easy to detect. This is a plan of that site, which shows us a little bit more about it. Firstly, it shows you that it was roofed using crux, which is a type of sort of bowed wood support for a roof. And we've got loads and loads of descriptions of these places being roofed with heather thatch. Other places near this tend to have post holes rather than crux slots. So they would have had roofs supported by a post, probably. But often roofs are quite hard to detect in archaeology. But one of the things that's really important for getting to know the archaeology of smuggling is the wider landscape. And one of the most important things about smuggling is that it depends on the rapid movement of what you're producing to markets where there's a demand for it. On the coasts, this can often mean the sea. On Isla, there was a huge amount of caves and bays being used. In this case, for the bothy I just showed you, it was by what is on that map, Loch Bennechen. It's on the river that goes upwards from it. And you can see that there was a road running really right past it, from which the distilling site would have been visible. And we've actually got a really great description of this road being used routinely by whiskey smugglers from the old statistical account, which I can never say, for Loch Carron. It is a really unusual entry because the minister who wrote it presumably got bored and decided to write a lyrical entry to the USA. And one of the stanzas goes, "From Castle Strom there is a road straight down to Keswick Ferry, and by this road the men of Skye do all their whiskey carry." So there is a traffic in whiskey going past this site. And in Strathconnan, almost adjacent to the modern road, you can actually pick up small bridge abutments and so on. So that road is still there today in parts. Especially in Strathconnan, there's an interesting correlation with shealing grounds. And for those that don't know, these were places where people moved their cattle in the summer, and that was to take them away from infields and from where crops grew. And there were sites that were associated with the manufacture of dairy products, and there was a commercial edge to the shealing economy as well. I've got an article coming out about this, but the use of these places as distilling sites postdates the shealings. So I think it's also interesting that after people were removed from these areas of land in schemes of improvement, usually led by landlords, there was a return to these for a subversive and illegal activity. And I think that's a really interesting sort of social dynamic. And I imagine there was a kind of thumbing your nose at authority that went along with this. The second type of site that Given discusses is the hearth. And there are some hearths that they don't tend to photograph very well in the form that they appeared in Michael Gibbons' typology. But there are also just freestanding hearths built in the landscape. The one on your left is from the west coast near Applecross, and it's just a small hearth fireplace with a little. I think it's got a little chimney. I've not been there, and it's dug into a peat bank. And then the sketch on your side is from the Highland HER, and it's in a cave near Cuig, also near Applecross. So these freestanding hearths, they can they're very low impact pieces of archaeology. And I haven't included a picture of a platform, a distilling platform, which is the other sort of type of site that Gibbon talked about, because frankly, they're very difficult to see. They do not look like much in a photograph. Occasionally, you will pick up a small line of arranged stones that has supported some kind of platform for working by a burn, though. So I propose that there are two other types of site that go along with the archaeology of distilling. And the first of these would be wash shelters. This is a name I've given them. We have great historical records for people joining cooperatively to buy distilling apparatus, and in doing so, they shared a lot of risk. If people got fined, there was money to pay those fines, and if people had the stills seized, there was a sharing of the risk in that group. And what these shelters would do would be to allow people to move one still between different batches of wash which were fermenting in different places in the landscape. This person in the slide is John Beach, who I used to work for, who runs a whiskey bar near Loch Ness. I worked there for about 10 years, and he helped me find this site. This is perhaps a more impressive example of a wash shelter. That's only about 1 meter by 1.5 meters internally, and you can see with the cold spring water coming out beside the site, you can see essentially where Wormtub and still would have been arrayed on the outside of it. So these allow people to work cooperatively and to share risk, and also to have multiple batches of wash fermenting in different parts of the landscape. It makes sense to do that because the fermentation takes quite a long time compared to the distillation, which you do over the course of a single night usually. And then this is the second type of whiskey distilling site that I would propose, and I like this picture. I think it's cheeky. It's a subterranean distilling site viewed from outside. I have drawn a sketch of this to make it more interpretable. It's about 1.5 meters deep. It's absolutely exceptional in terms of workmanship. And I went here with a good friend, Peter Boy Jensen, and he's another archaeologist who works mainly around distilling. The quality of the site is extraordinary. It's very, very overgrown, but the walls are absolutely beautiful. And there's also a very discernible lade that takes water into the top of the site and down into it to cool a still worm, and a semicircular still hearth there in the northwest corner of the building. So it's right beside a burn, and you really wouldn't know it was there. And from this region, we actually have a little bit of documentary evidence about these subterranean stills happening. In the 5th report on the distilleries, which was a report to the House of Commons, a landowner for the Cabrera was asked about the stills. Are the stills concealed, or are they erected in such a way as to be visible? They're always concealed from me. I've once or twice tumbled in when I've been shooting, which gives us the impression that you could literally fall into these. And other types of subterranean sites are out there. This one's in the lowlands, actually not the Highlands, but it was excavated by the Peeblesshire Archaeology Society. We've also got a really nice material record connected to illicit distillation. It's not a really big amount of illicit stills that survive. Many of these would have been recycled. They were quite valuable, so often they haven't survived into the present day. But we do have examples out there. In the middle of your of the slide here, you can see a still worm, which was used for cooling spirits. A really big chunky thing, this one, and I expect rather late. And in the top there, you can see these glass beads that were used to measure alcoholic strength, presumably used by producers and gaugers, excise people. And then the evidence, again, we've got we have actual stills. This one is held in Amfashka in Newton Moor. So at the top you can see the body of the still, and the middle a two-arm still head, which would have been used to boil off wash, which is a larger distillation, and at the bottom a one-arm still head, which would have been used to distill the spirit, the second distillation. So I think it's also worth noting, when I've said people are everyone's really involved, it tends to be the poorer people who are using these stills, and a lot of the money they make was then essentially alienated from them in terms of much higher rent. Landlords were generally quite happy to let illicit distillation continue because they could hike up their rents. It also meant they had someone to sell their grain to. And then the smugglers, if they weren't distilling themselves, there were also regularly trained smugglers, as they appear in accounts, who made a profession of just transporting the spirit. And presumably that worked along the same lines as droving, where you would pay someone at the distillery for the for what they'd produced, and then you'd go and make a profit on it for yourself. So the main benefactors to illicit distillation are not really the illicit distillers, and indeed there are no instances really of people who make a great fortune from illicit distilling. There are some people who did all right out of it, but the people who tended to benefit really were the people who then went legit. We also have from the historical record an idea of some sites that are illicit stills essentially being legal and then being treated as illicit. And there are some documents in existence that show that some stills were built by head dykes, and they were used to distill whiskey where they could be watched, essentially. But I won't go into that because I'm taking up rather a lot of time just now. So this is a really interesting and exciting thing, and I was really lucky to do this excavation with my friend Peter Jensen and with Ali Cameron as well. This is an early licensed distillery in the Cabrera. It was related to that wash shelter that I showed you earlier. That was the site people used before they went legit. After 1824, people in the Highlands could use a uniform still license to go into legal distilling, and the Highland line was abolished. And this went a long way to eradicating smuggling as a really big problem, although it did persist, and it sort of reared its head again at specific times, particularly during the phylloxera epidemic in the late 1800s. So we got to excavate this farmhouse distillery, which is one of the types of distilling I was talking about at the start. And what we got really was just fantastic archaeological evidence. And we managed to basically come up with a floor plan for the distillery. We were able to approximate the size of the utensils that were used. We got examples of material culture, and I'll show you these properly right now. And we also got to see how legislation impacted how these buildings were designed. So here's a 3D model, and I'll just talk you through briefly how it works. So the number 1 there is where a still would have sat. And the number 2 is where the worm tub would probably have been, and number 3 is where the spirit would have merged from the still worm and into some kind of receiver, even if that was just straight into a barrel. And you can actually see that there's a really nice stone-lined drain there where the number 3 is, and that doubled as a barrel run as well. It's at a slant. And I'll show you 2 ways now that the legislation is knowable through this archaeology, which I think is really cool. So the first is that in this room with the drain at the bottom there, there's no direct entry into that room from the rest of the distillery, which is a result of the Excise Act stating that the end of the still room has to be enclosed, and it has to be in a space where distillery workers essentially can't get at it, and where you can't secret away any spirit. So the person who was allowed into that room would probably have been the distillery manager and the excise person. And in the left there, you can see a kind of, well, essentially a hole. It's a vent that goes through the room. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but right here. And this is a vent that goes from the outside of the building through here, straight to the still base there. And that's because in the Excise Act, it's stipulated that there must be a vent that goes straight to the still base. So it went straight through the bottom of the building there. And the good news is that there are loads of these places that are unexcavated. Here are some of the bits of material culture there that we got. So we got a lovely clay pipe. We got some bits of earthenware bottles and a barrel band there from the barrel run. And yes, as I say, there are loads of these places out there. Acharacan there is quite a famous early distillery that was run by, he was known as the Cripple Captain. And we can see sluices and a mill dam. Nothing there marked as a distillery, but armed with that map, we could probably go to the site and work out which was which. That's assuming it's not been developed and concreted over, which of course a lot of farms will have been. On the left there, we've got Tumnavan Distillery, which is also in the Cabrera, and this unroofed building here actually shares all the same characteristics as Black Middens. We know it was out of use by this time. This is the first OS map, and so it's shown as an unroofed building. But it follows a sluice and a water channel, and it's just like Black Middens. It is on this kind of gradient and it's terraced, and that's because the entire distilling process was basically reliant on gravity at this site, and likely at Tumnavan as well. And these distilleries appear on some maps. There's an improvement map here. This is Black Middens here, marked as a distillery, and a really early example there from the Black Isle at Taradale House, which was a distillery right beside Taradale House. So that's the sort of licensed distilleries that arrived after the Excise Act. And I should say, before the Excise Act, it was possible to run a licensed distillery in the Highlands. It was just very hard. It's very hard to afford. But I think there were about 9 in the Highlands in 1816. And then the end of this story really comes with these larger capitalist distilleries, and I thought Lagavulin is a really good example here, mainly because it's my favourite whiskey, that and Coolila. But Lagavulin started as 10 small smuggling bothies. It then progressed to being 2 small distilleries, and then, if my memory serves me right, in 1816, John Johnson bought them and combined them into the one big Lagavulin venture. So it's kind of emblematic of the story of whiskey distilling. And just before I wrap up, I've talked about how women have a bigger place in the history of distilling, but we should also think about groups that we now see as marginalized groups as also being really important in this story. So travellers from Ireland, referred to in derogatory tones always in these records, were really important in Islay for coming and converting people's cauldrons and boilers into stills. That's in 1799, that little document I'm showing you. And then there's also evidence from the early 1800s and at Tomic of Donald Ross, an itinerant coppersmith who was charged for discharging a firearm at excise officers. So there are other groups that we can look at and probably need much more attention in the archaeological and historical record, especially of whisky distilling. So I'm just going to conclude, and these are the sort of parting thoughts. The first is that whisky is a really integral part of the broad story of commercialization in the Highlands and Islands, and that's history that goes way back into the 1500s. When you consider that our first written account of whisky in Scotland is in 1494, this is really all of its history. And I'm absolutely certain that distilling was happening long before 1494 in Scotland. Ordinary Highlanders and distillers were highly dynamic and reactive to external pressures, including wars, but also legislation and the schemes of landowners. We should also acknowledge that women have a very long and interesting history relating to distilling. And this is something that the whisky industry is starting to get better at acknowledging, but there have been, unfortunately, in the last year, some events which have shown that the contribution of women to whisky distilling is still not as valued as it should be. And the last thought really is that the scale of archaeology relating to whisky distilling in any of its forms is barely hinted at in today's HER, in today's historic environment record, and there's a lot of work to do, really, to try and trace it more properly. So I'll just finish by thanking my supervisors, Professor Jane Downs, Dr. Elizabeth Ritchie, and Dr. Piers Dixon, who've been extraordinary over the last few years. And I'd like to acknowledge my funders as well, the European Social Research Fund, through Developing Scotland's Workforce. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Darroch. That was fascinating. We can't give you a big round of applause as we would have done, but I'm sure everybody's applauding in their own homes now. And folk are saying in the chat here too, thanks, that was fascinating. Can I catch up later on the recording? Someone is asking. Yeah, it is our intention to put this recording out so it'll be available publicly. We'll just have to figure out technically how to do it first, but it has been recorded at least. Okay, we've had a few questions coming up in the chat while you were speaking, and you can still post more questions to Darroch in the chat, and it's helpful if you address them to everyone. So I'll just take the first questions that came in. Yes, let me see. One question was, were they always beside a burn, beside a stream?
Yeah, almost always. There's a couple of sites that are really interesting, and there's one in particular that I've been scratching my head about recently, near Abriacan, and it's really difficult to say for sure it's a distilling site. Although I've got historical records that lead me to believe it is, but actually water would have had to be brought quite a long way into it. And then there are cases of water being diverted from burns into caves near the coast for distillation. But 9 times out of 10, these are directly beside a burn. The variations really, I think, are often regional. So if you're distilling in a coastal location, that's going to have an impact on the type of place you can distill. So But yes, almost always beside a burn. Yeah.
That makes sense. And then we had a couple of people were asking right at the beginning there precisely where the Highland line went, and one commented that it's interesting to see Speyside has been included, and another person said it's strange how Arran and Kintyre were not included.
Yeah, yeah. So there's a really interesting perspective when you think about the whiskey regions as they exist now, and anyone who's watching this as a sort of whiskey enthusiast will have quite a clear idea in their head about that the Speyside region not being part of the Highland region. But yeah, for legislative purposes, it was behind the Highland line, and actually in the OSA, in the old statistical account for Aberdeen, there's records of distillers from Aberdeen basically all emigrating as soon as the Highland line was established, because they only had to move 10 or 15 miles and they didn't have to pay any tax. So yeah, basically that Highland line did include Speyside, and Kintyre, yeah, that was not part of the Highland region. That Highland line is described very well, and in very long-winded terms in the legislation. But essentially, that blue line I put there follows it pretty well. Yeah.
Thank you. And then the next question was the sites that have been documented. How were they found? Are they documented in literature, or were they found through walkover surveys, or how were they found?
So the majority of the sites that I've used in the PhD were identified in earlier walkover surveys that hadn't been done by me, although I have found 5 or 6 new illicit distilling sites. I would love to have dedicated loads of time to finding more, but the reason I didn't is simply that looking for sites that were designed not to be found is a really is a really dangerous thing to do as a PhD method. So yeah, I've used a lot of sites that were already known, and usually these have been discovered in walkover surveys, but also like the way people understand their history locally is really important. So the sites I've found near Drumnadrochit, they've essentially been found on hearsay, and my granddad used to distill up here, and so on. And when you follow the when you follow the trail, yeah, they're still there.
They are, wow. So that was a folk memory that was preserved in a family. That's fascinating.
People tend to be very proud of their history, especially as illicit distillers. And it was a bit of a concern for me early on that my work might involve incriminating people's dead ancestors. But generally, people really want to know. So they're really interested and they're very proud of it.
I get the impression in Orkney that the Highland Park Distillery is proud of their founder, Mansi Junsen, who was an illicit distiller.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are some really big names in whiskey today that really quite clearly draw their link back to illicit distillation, and it's often used as a selling point, often related to the kind of romantic view of it. Of course, the backdrop to illicit distilling, even if there was an element of being adventurous and cheeky, the backdrop to it is really grinding poverty. So there's a romantic way to look at it, but the reality was that as well.
Yeah, of course. We have a question here about what the average quantity was of the product. How much were they able to produce at such a site?
Yeah, that I didn't go into that in this, but yeah. So from records of seizures of wash generally. You often find people seizing 240 gallons of wash at a time. And if you presume about a 10% yield, you've got many gallons of whiskey. You've got around 24 gallons. The yield was probably more around 7%. But so you can take that and work backwards. Just under 200 gallons of whiskey from a big illicit distilling bothy in Russia is that wouldn't be exceptional. So this is big money that people are talking about.
Wow. And then somebody asked here, how was the equipment acquired? You talked about these Irish people who would take cauldrons and things and make them. So what was it mostly repurposed like that, or was there also equipment especially made for the purpose?
There was actually a really great article many years ago by I.A. Glenn, and it went through the business books of a coppersmith in Campbelltown, and a completely legit coppersmith, and they were fitting out illicit stills for people commercially. And we also have Joseph Mitchell had a memoir written in the 1800s, and he also talks about the coppersmith in Inverness. His sign was a wooden cutout of an illicit still, or of a still anyway. So there were definitely ways to. Yes, that will be Robert Armour. I was just seeing someone reply, yes, it was Robert Armour's still books. So there were ways to get this legally, and then I imagine the itinerant coppersmiths were often working as sort of maintaining and repairing things. In the case of Islay and people coming over in great numbers to fit them out, that'll have a lot to do with the proximity of Islay and Ireland. So there's definitely a big opportunity for people there to make a bit of money. So there is definitely, there were two sides to that. There were businessmen and, well, Anthony Coppersmith was a businessman as well, I suppose. So both were true.
The next question was, how do these glass measuring beads work?
Yeah, so they measure the specific gravity of the alcohol. And I've had this explained to me, but it's far too scientific for me. But essentially what you do is you can put each of these beads has a number on it, and the number relates to a strength. So the beads that you put in will sink if they don't match the strength of the alcohol. So the one that has the glass bead that floats in, so say bead number 20 is the strength of double distilled whiskey, that will float in a glass of double distilled whiskey, and you'd know then that's what you were selling or what you were taxing.
Aha! I never knew that.
I was very lucky to be lent a set of these a few months ago by Alan Winchester of Glenlivet, and he's a real enthusiast about whiskey history and really knows a lot, and he's got a collection of these things, so he lent me them, and then lockdown happened, so I still got them. I promise, if you're there, Alan, you will get them back.
It was interesting to hear you say that women were working in whiskey distilling too. What kind of roles do they play?
Every single role, as producers and also as smugglers. There are anecdotal stories of women walking to towns with fake pregnant bellies that were hollow that had whiskey in them. I've not found any, which would be great. But yeah, they were producers and consumers as well, and smugglers. There's also a really interesting element as women being involved in deforcing the excise and stopping them doing their duty. And there are records from Russia of whole crowds of women assembling at Redcastle, armed with rocks generally, to divorce the excise, and for the army having to be brought in. And there are even records of men dressing up as women to divorce the excise. And if people are familiar with the Rebecca riots in England, that there's actually a theme of men dressing there as the sort of the archetypical Rebecca. So yeah, female identity, being a woman did not stop you being involved in illicit distillation. And my favorite description of an illicit still comes from Anne Mackay of Strathconnan in 1834, who gave evidence to a murder trial. She gave a precognition to a charge of murder, and she describes a whole night at an illicit distilling bothy where this person was murdered afterwards. And I think it's the only description of an illicit distilling bothy that you can get from someone who's really involved in the manufacture. Most of the description you find are male, middle class sort of tourists to the Highlands. So it's amazing that one really good description comes from a woman in Strathconnan.
Wow, yeah. Over time here, but I just have a couple of other questions that were asked that we could try and answer briefly. And one was it dangerous? Is there a risk of explosion, etc.?
I expect there was. I don't have any evidence for it, but actually, one hint is that there are lots of photographs of people distilling outside, but we know these bothies were constructed to distill in, and a lot of the distilling that's happening outside in the photographs is near a home. So presumably the distilling would have happened in the home. And the reason that they're probably doing that, taking that picture outside, is partly because it would be dark inside. But you wouldn't want to use like a big 18th century flash in 19th century flash rather in a house that was filled with alcohol vapors. So presumably that there was a small risk, but I think the main risks would be to do with losing your product or violence that might occur in the process of smuggling.
And the next question was, has anybody done anything on the early history of distilling in Orkney specifically?
In Orkney specifically? Well, I expect the person to talk to about that would be Julie Cassidy, who's tracing the history of Highland Park. There are illicit stills in Orkney, not a huge number that I'm aware of, but there's definitely one in Hoy that Dan Lee alerted me to. But yes, I don't know that much about distilling in Orkney at an early time. If I was going to be very bold and say, this is how it came into the country, it probably came from Ireland, where there's definitely 13th century distilling, and also possibly from England around the time of the dissolution of the monasteries, when lots of monks who would have known how to distill would have been moving around into communities.
And speaking of Dan, he's asking, how many new stills did you find?
I think 6.
Okay, thanks.
Which doesn't sound very impressive, but they're really difficult to find. Yeah, so about 6 illicit stills, I think, that hadn't been in the historic environment record, and I've identified the sites of some farmhouse distilleries too that I don't think there was any awareness of either.
6 is good though. So I have a technical question here, and that is, when you ferment and the wash ferment, you need heat. Were the wash shelters heated?
The wash shelters are very small, so I think possibly the fermenting liquor would have created some of its own heat. But also, we're probably talking about quite long periods of fermentation. So, yes, I think you boil when you mash something, but then you add yeast, and it can be left to its own devices, essentially, as long as the environment's warm enough. But that is interesting, and one of the things that's really interesting here is that this happened in the winter and the autumn, rather than the summer generally. So this is happening in a cold climate, uh, and presumably over quite a long period of time.
And then I have two suggestions from you, not questions. The one was you could possibly use machine learning approaches with satellite imagery to help identify. And the other suggestion was that you should enter the sites that you found into the records so that it's updated.
Yes. So the first question there, the suggestion. Yes, I've thought about that. I'm not doing it as part of this project, but I think it's definitely something that can be applied in the future. But I do think you need the specific historical information as well. There are areas of the Highlands that would have been better for distilling than others. And sorry, was the second question there, is it being fed into the HER?
Yes, or whether you would fit it in.
Yeah, yes. I have been as I go. And I think 4 of the sites that I've found I still need to actually report, but that's because I wasn't quite confident enough to do that in my first year. But yeah, so I've reported 2, and then there are some on Forestry and Land, Scotland's Land, that I've reported to Matt Ritchie as well. So yes, they are going to end up in the HER, I hope.
I would just give you one last question because we are quite a lot over time now, although the questions keep coming in. Sorry to everyone who's not had their question read, but the last question was there a branding illicit products, or would you just purchase generic spirit from smugglers?
That's a great question. Yes, there was. I think a really good example is King George's visit to Edinburgh, where he would drink nothing. This was really directed by Walter Scott, who wanted him to be popular with Scots, but he would drink nothing but pure Glenlivet. And there was no Glenlivet distillery as such then, but it was whiskey that came from that region, and that was known as Glenlivet. And then the distilleries, once they were set up, really vied to have that title. And if you go back a few years, you get lots of distilleries in Speyside that have their name and then Glenlivet. So that was definitely an aspect of it. And the same goes for Islay. People valued Islay malt and saw it as something that was very distinctive. So whether there was any intentional cultivation of a brand is less certain, but yes, the brands came about and people bought them. But there would have been a great variety.
That's interesting. So the branding kind of grows out of the reputation that the districts had. Yeah. Okay, Professor Jane Downs says, thank you, Darroch. That was really great. Well done. And I think we can all chime in with that, as people are doing in the chat. Thank you so much. And everybody's saying how fascinating it was. Brilliant.
Well, thank you so much for chairing this. I really enjoyed it. And thank you to so many people for coming along.
We had 251 at the peak, but people are dropping in and out. So I think in total we'll have had more than that.
Wow, that's fantastic. Oh, well, thank you so much. It's been great.
Cheers, everyone. Come back next month when we'll hear from an archaeologist who works with Forestry and Land Scotland. So we're always doing these seminars on the last Friday of the month at 4 o'clock. And they'll be up on the UHI events calendar. You can find the link there.
Oh, yeah, there are some more questions. Wow, great. Okay.